So, back on April 7th, 2026, a crucial vote happened at the UN Security Council. It was a resolution to secure the world's most important energy choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. And it failed. Vetoed by both China and Russia. Now, on the surface, this might look like just another day of diplomatic chess. But what if it was more than that? What if this veto was actually a major signal that the fundamental rules of global trade and security are being rewritten right before our eyes?
Was this just, another bit of geopolitical wrangling in New York, a procedural footnote in a much wider conflict?
Or was it something much bigger? A deliberate message that the rules that have governed the world's oceans and trade routes are now fundamentally up for grabs. Okay, let's get into it.
Here's what we're going to cover in this explainer. First, we'll break down the standoff at the UN. Then, we'll dig into the specific reasons why China and Russia cast those vetoes. After that, we'll look at the absolutely devastating economic shockwave. And finally, we'll ask, what does all this mean for the future of global diplomacy?
All right, Act 1, the standoff. To really get what happened with the vote, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the crisis that started this whole thing.
It all kicks off on February 28, 2026, with U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. In response, Iran does what it's been threatening to do for years. It shuts down the Strait of Hormuz. And just like that, the global economy starts to panic. So Bahrain, along with other Gulf states, rushes a resolution to the UN Security Council to try and reopen that waterway, which all leads up to that critical vote on April 7th.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. You have to look at how the resolution itself changed. The first draft was seriously aggressive. It used the phrase all necessary means, which is basically UN speak for authorizing military force. But that hit a wall, and not just with Russia and China, France pushed back too. So after some intense back and forth, the text got watered down a lot. The final version just strongly encourages defensive stuff like escorting ships. The really crucial takeaway here is this. A major diplomatic battle was already fought and lost by the resolution's supporters before the vetoes were even cast.
Act 2, the vetoes. So even with that much softer language, the resolution still failed. Why? Why did China and Russia refuse to support it or even just, abstain?
Well, Russia's ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, framed his country's veto in these very stark legal terms. He argued that passing this wasn't just about Hormuz, it was about creating a dangerous precedent for international law. So let's unpack what he actually meant by that. Moscow's argument was kind of layered. First, they said the text was completely one-sided. It condemned Iran for closing the strait but didn't say a word about the US and Israeli strikes that Russia considered the root cause of the whole crisis. Second, and this is a big one, it totally ignored the sovereignty of Iran and Oman, whose territorial waters actually make up the strait. From Moscow's point of view, authorizing international naval action in those waters was a clear violation of the UN Charter. The bottom line for Russia was this. The resolution looked like an attempt to internationalize a territorial waterway, and that was a precedent they were just not going to accept.
Now let's look at China. Their ambassador, Fu Kong, echoed a lot of what Russia was saying, but with a really particular focus. His key phrase was legal veneer. Basically, Beijing saw this resolution as the West trying to get a legal permission slip for future military operations.
Like Russia, China kept insisting that any UN action had to address the root cause, those initial US-Israeli strikes. They argued the resolution would only add fuel to the fire and grant a license to use force that could just escalate the whole conflict. China's position was that the Council's #1 priority had to be de-escalation and dialogue, not authorizing naval patrols. In fact, they and Russia even proposed their own alternative resolution, which they called more balanced. For China, this was really about drawing a line in the sand against what it sees as a Western-led interventionist agenda.
Act 3, the shockwave. Okay, so while all these diplomats are debating legal principles in New York, the global economy is just hemorrhaging. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz wasn't some abstract problem. It was an immediate, catastrophic event.
And this chart right here shows you exactly why. The Strait of Hormuz is pretty much the jugular vein of the global energy market. We're talking about roughly 1/5 of all the oil the world consumes and 1/5 of all liquefied natural gas, all passing through this tiny little waterway. You just can't turn off a tap that big without some absolutely severe consequences.
And the shutdown was immediate and almost total. Before the crisis, you had an average of about 138 commercial ships going through the strait every single day. After the closure, that number dropped to less than 10. The artery was just completely clogged.
This map gives you a real sense of the geographic problem. All of that energy infrastructure you see,
From Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, it all relies on that single, narrow exit point to the Arabian Sea. When that closes, the whole system just backs up. Producers are forced to slash their output because they literally have nowhere to store the oil.
The fallout was just staggering. The International Energy Agency called it the single largest crude oil supply disruption in market history, period. Qatar Energy declared force majeure, yanking 20% of the world's LNG supply off the market overnight. European gas prices, they doubled. You had over 130 container ships just trapped inside the Gulf. And the impact went way beyond energy. The World Food Program estimated that the price shocks from all this could push 45 million more people into extreme hunger.
So, what does this all mean for the future? The failure to pass this resolution wasn't just the end of a debate. It was probably the beginning of a new and much more uncertain era.
So let's break down the key takeaways. First, this vote shows that a UN veto is never just a procedural move. It's a statement of strategic intent. Russia and China made a calculated choice. They prioritized the principles of national sovereignty and anti-interventionism over the principle of free navigation. Second, this seriously challenges the UN's traditional role. It suggests that when it comes to these vital choke points, we are now firmly in an era of great power competition. And third, if collective security at the UN fails, it probably means future crises like this will be handled by unilateral actions or coalitions of the willing, completely outside the UN's framework.
And this leaves us with a final, really unsettling question. For centuries, the freedom of the seas has been the bedrock of global trade, often underwritten by a general consensus among the great powers. But after the veto of April 7th, that consensus is clearly broken. So in this increasingly divided world, who guarantees that freedom now?